Good morning, seventh graders. It is Wednesday, April 15th, and we are currently going to be reading chapter 22. We are near the end of our book, and you will need to turn to page 169. You will be doing pages 98 and 99 in your journal, so that should be pretty simple. So, yesterday when we left off, Lyddie has been fired. Now what? Chapter 22, Farewell. Well, that gives us a hint. The bear had won. It had stolen her home, her family, her work, her good name. She had thought she was so strong, so tough, and she had just stood there like a day-old lamb and let it gobble her down. And in this case, it's figurative language. She's calling Mr. Marsden the bear. Okay? She looked around the crowded room that had been her home, the two double beds squeezed in with less than a foot between them for passage. She thought of Betsy sitting cross-legged on the one, bent slightly toward the candle, reading aloud while she, Lyddie, lay motionless, lost in Oliver's world. And Amelia. Amelia would know what turpentine, whatever the wretched word was, wretched meaning like horrible word that got her fired. Amelia was sure to know what it meant. She could see the older girl's eyebrows arch and her lips purse. But why are you asking? Indeed, so I can know what they charged against me, why I've lost my job, why I've been dismissed without a certificate. You? Betsy would laugh. Not our Lyddie, Mr. Marsden's best girl. Meanwhile, Prudence would be busy explaining the meaning of the cussed word. Thank God Rachel was safe. She had a home and food and school. And she had a mother. And Charlie. I will not cry. She began to pack her things, stuffing them unfolded into the tiny gunny sack that had been her only luggage when she came. She almost laughed aloud. The sack wouldn't hold her extra clothes, much less her books. Well, she was a rich woman now. She could afford a proper trunk for her belongings, even if she had no place to take them. They let me go, she explained to Mrs. Bedloe. The landlady was incredulous, like, what? Like, I can't believe it's true. But why? She asked. You were Mr. Marsden's best girl. Everyone said so. Lyddie gave a laugh more like a horse whinny than any human sound. Then everyone is wrong. She could not bring herself to describe to Mrs. Bedloe the two encounters in the weaving room. She must somehow have caused the first. She knew so little of the ways of men and women that she must have, without realizing, given him some sign. No, she didn't. Mr. Marsden was a deacon of his church. He was not a likable man, but surely, and last night, mercy on her, she'd acted like a crazed beast. Why, even her own mother, who died in an asylum, had never gone wild like that. She did not like Mr. Marsden. She had never liked him, but she had tried to please him, tried to win his approval by being the best. And though she needed to know what it was exactly that he was accusing her of, she knew he had not told the agent of those encounters. So it was something else she had done wrong. She would have asked Mrs. Bedloe, but she was afraid the word would come out turpentine, and Mrs. Bedloe would laugh. She couldn't bear to be laughed at, not just now. I'll be out of my room by tomorrow, the next day at the latest. But where will you go? Don't worry for me. I can't stand it if you are kind, and I might break down. Back to housekeeping, I reckon. That was it. Tryphena would be sure to take her in. She went to the bank and withdrew all her money, $243.87. Then she went to the bookstore. She wanted to give Bridget a copy of Oliver Twist, even if the girl couldn't really read it yet. She'd be able to in time. Will there be anything else for you today, Miss Wharton? They were friends now, the bookseller and she. She hesitated, but what did it matter? She would never be in again. Do you have a book that tells the meaning of words? Ah, he said, we have an old Alexander dictionary, of course, and then there's Webster's and Worcester's, which are more up to date. I think I need an up-to-date one, she said. She didn't want to risk buying one that didn't have the one word she needed. The bookseller got down two fat books, parts 1 and 2 of an American dictionary of the English language, and then a third. Many people prefer the Worcester, he said, indicating the third book. It's a bit newer, and all in the one volume. Lyddie paid for the Worcester and forced herself to take it out of the shop before opening it. As soon as she was out of sight of the bookshop window, she rested her parcels on the sidewalk and opened the dictionary. It took her some time to find the word. The pages were thin and her fingers calloused and clumsy, and she did not know the spelling, but she found it at last. What? She would have howled in the street had it not been so crowded with passers-bys. She was not a vile or shameful character. She was not base or depraved. She was only ignorant, and what was the sin in that? He was the evil one to accuse her of such. She had done nothing evil, only foolish. She rushed back to her room. What could she do? The damage was done. If only she had known what was going on when she was in the agent's office. How that vile man was lying. Oh, the agent was quick to believe him. When I cried out, it was I who was made to seem in the wrong. I was unladylike. That was my crime. She wrote the letters in a fury, burning herself with sealing wax. Her hand was shaking so. She rushed out of the house, her bonnet ribbons loose, her shawl flying. By the time she got to the acre, she was out of breath, and could hardly ask the children playing in the street where Bridget's house might be. The first child she asked looked up with wide, frightened eyes and ran away without speaking. She stood long enough to tie her bonnet properly and catch her breath before asking another. She pointed dumbly to a shack that turned out not to be Bridget's house at all, but the housewife inside knew Bridget and gave Lyddie proper directions. Bridget herself answered the door. "Oh, Lyddie, what have they done?" "I'm dismissed," Lyddie said. "No, it cannot be." "It can't be helped. It's done. But they must not dismiss you. I've already written a letter to Mr. Marsden. I told him if he dismissed you or bothered you in any way, I would tell his wife exactly what happened in the weaving room. Now here's the letter addressed to her. If there is any problem, you must mail it at once." Bridget stared at her open mouth. "At once. You must swear to me you will." The girl nodded. "And now I'd like to sit down if I could." "Oh, I'm terrible rude." Bridget stepped aside and let her into the tiny shack. The smell was strong of food and body sweat. It was dark, but Lyddie could see children's eyes large and staring. "Me mother's house cleaning today." Bridget picked up a pile of what looked like rags, but might have been clothing, off a rough stool, and Lyddie sat down gratefully. She was still tired from last night, tired as she had been after her sickness, her bones aching with it. "Thank you," she said. "Where will you be going?" "Not far from here, I hope." "They didn't give me a certificate, so I have to go." "And it's all me fault." "No, you mustn't blame yourself." There was no place else to sit except the beds, so Bridget stood watching her. In the darkness of the room, the only noise was the rustle of the children, shifting, staring. She had stopped gasping for breath. It was time to leave. "I'll be going, Bridget. Oh, yes, I nearly forgot." She handed the girl the parcel containing Bridget's oat primer and Oliver Twist. "So you won't forget me altogether, eh?" she said, and fled so she wouldn't have to listen to Bridget's sobs. That evening, just at the closing bell, she made her way down the street beyond the boarding house road to the trim frame houses of the overseers of the Concord Corporation. She didn't know which house was his, but it didn't matter. He would have to come this way. She stood in the shadow of the first house and waited. There was no mistaking his walk. Like a little bantam rooster, he came all alone. Does he have any friends at all? She shoved the thought aside. She mustn't let anything dilute her anger. That means make it less than it was. Like if you dilute sugar in water, it's making it go away. "Mr. Marsden." She stepped out of the shadow and stood in his path. He stopped, alarmed. They were nearly the same height, and she stood close to his face and spoke with deadly quiet, the long brim of her bonnet nearly brushing his cheeks. "Yes, it's me, Lydia Wharton." "Miss Wharton," he breathed out her name. "I am mean and I am cheap. Sometimes I am a coward and oftentimes I'm selfish. I ain't a beauty to look at, but I am not vile, shameful, base, and depraved." "What?" "You accuse me of moral turpitude, Mr. Marsden. I am here to say I am not guilty." He stepped backward with a little puff of a gasp. "I have here a letter I wrote. I will tell you what it says. It says, if you cause Bridget McBride to lose her position, I will see that your wife is informed about what really happens in the weaving room after hours." "My wife?" he whispered. "Mrs. Overseer Marsden. I figure she ought to know if there is moral turpitude occurring in her husband's weaving room." She jammed the letter in the overseer's hand and closed his reluctant fist around it. Good night, Mr. Marsden. I hope you sleep easy before you die. She took a stage to Boston. Hardly anyone did these days. The train was so much faster, but she had nowhere to go in such a hurry, and the ride gave her time to compose herself. Boston was a terrible place, older and even dirtier and more crowded than Lowell. The streets were narrow, and Lyddie stepped gingerly around the refuse and animal droppings, lifting her skirt with one hand and trying to balance her new trunk in her other arm. She should have found a safe place to leave it, but how did one do that in an unknown city? At last she found the address. She looked through a glass windowed door and saw Diana herself, tall and pale, but no longer thin. She was speaking to a customer, her head slightly bent toward the short woman, a polite smile on her face. Lyddie shifted the heavy trunk under her left arm and pushed open the door. A bell rang, and Diana looked up at the sound. At first she nodded politely, her attention still with the chattering customer. Then she recognized Lyddie, and her face was transformed. Excuse me a moment, she said to the woman, and came over and took the trunk. Lyddie! Her voice was still quiet and beautifully low-pitched. How wonderful to see you! There was no time to talk until the customer's order was complete and the bell rang, signaling her departure. How are you, Lyddie? Diana asked. They dismiss me, she said, for moral turpitude. For what? Diana was almost laughing. It means, I know what it means, Diana said gently. I'm intimately acquainted with the term myself, but you? Surely. You are not vile, base, or depraved, Lyddie said. Thank you. Diana tried not to smile, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her. And neither are you. What I can't imagine is how. It was Mr. Marsden. Ah, yes, dear Mr. Marsden. When Lyddie told the whole story, nearly crying again in her rage, she suddenly realized that Diana was shaking with laughter. It weren't funny, eh? She protested. No, no, of course not. I'm sorry. But I'm imagining his face when you pounced at him last night, just when he thought he'd won, when he'd rid himself so neatly of evidence. Lyddie saw the rosebud mouth shaped into an O of fright. It was satisfying, wasn't it? And his wife is a perfect terror, but you know that. I didn't think anyone else would believe me against him. Oh, she's a terror, all right. Everyone says so. She's a fright, I promise you. She got up and poured them each a cup of tea. Let's celebrate, shall we? Oh, Lyddie, it's so good of you to come. How can I help you? But she had come to help Diana. I thought to help you if I could. Thank you, but I'm doing all right, as you can see. It was hard at first, but no one seemed to want a husbandless woman expecting a child. But the proprietress here was ill and desperate for help, so we needed one another. It's worked out well. She's been so kind, and her daughter will look out for the baby when it comes. She smiled happily. Like family to me. She reached over and patted Lyddie's knee. But you understand. Lyddie spent the night with Diana. Everyone was kind. Diana had her family at last. Then why had something snapped like a broken warp thread inside Lyddie's soul? Wasn't she happy for Diana? Surely, surely she was. Happy and greatly relieved. You must write to Bridget and tell her you are fine, eh? Lyddie said as they parted the next morning. She can read now, and she worries. It rained all the way through New Hampshire, a steady, wearying drizzle. Lyddie rode inside the coach, and there was only one other passenger, an old man who took no notice of her. She was grateful because she cried most of the way. She, tough as gristle Lyddie, her face in her handkerchief, her head turned toward the shaded window. But the tumult that had raged inside her damped down more and more, as though beat into the muddy earth under the horses' hoofs. When they finally crossed the bridge into Vermont, the sun came out and turned the leafless trees into silver against the deep green of the evergreen of the mountain slopes. The air was clean and cold, the sky blue, more like a bright day at winter's end than November. Okay.